It is no secret that the European settlers exploited the indigenous people of North America. With a long-standing history of oppressive action from the Europeans, it is important to understand some of the steps taken that have further pushed people into oppressive environments through systemic racism. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, also known as the Trail of Tears, signed by Andrew Jackson, forced the migration of indigenous people from their homes in the eastern parts of the U.S. to specifically designated Indian Territory west of the Mississippi. This law was constructed primarily by the Van Buren administration, but Jackson insisted that this law was best for indigenous people, which he saw as savages and referred to as my red children. He viewed indigenous people as collateral damage in a grand push to achieve progress and further settlement in the United States for white Americans. Through this policy, tens of thousands of indigenous people of all ages died in forced removal. Those displaced from this policy still struggle with poverty and intergenerational trauma through upheld systemic racism. Jackson signed 70 removal treaties for indigenous people, causing them to be deemed trespassers on land they had owned for centuries and forced to leave by the United States military. Most indigenous people ended up in modern-day Oklahoma. Following the Trail of Tears, the U.S. government enacted forced assimilation from 1868 to 1951. Some historians argue these policies worked to preserve indigenous communities. While the intentions might have been to help, the fact remains that culture and language was lost, and this was done through forms of abuse of the indigenous people. Indigenous children were forced to attend boarding school, where any remnants of indigenous culture, whether through language, dress, religion, or activity, there was an attempt at removal through the school's teachings, as well as pressure through different forms of abuse done to the children, both physical and emotional. This further added to the intergenerational trauma that indigenous people face, as it states that their culture and history are not justified to exist, as well as upholding systemic racism, as further laws were based on such ideals. As white populations were settling further west in the 1800s, there became increasing pressure on the removed groups to give up some of their new land, such as the Dakotas, to enter into treaties. Indigenous people who did not leave faced concentrations onto even smaller parcels of land. Though reservations were authorized, reports from the end of the 19th century about the poor quality of life on reservations led to the federal government to change to a new policy, the Allotment Act, based on forced assimilation instead of concentration and isolation onto reservations. With the goal of systemically pressuring indigenous people into becoming farmers and ranchers, the U.S. government allowed individuals to own even smaller parcels of land. However, this allowed for white settlers to take excess land left over. The policy ended in 1934 as it was clear that disbanding reservations had failed. Indigenous people eventually received new rights and obtained some tribal sovereignty and land management by tribes. These tribes were still forced into rural communities that were difficult to farm and ranch on, and moving back to tribal sovereignty meant that individuals could no longer own land and therefore could not build wealth. Although there are some benefits to communal living, the core issues are very much related to abject poverty that systemic racism, intergenerational trauma, and undemocratic policies placed on indigenous people. With the ongoing issues brought on indigenous people due to policies that continuously displaced people, as well as policies that essentially told the indigenous people that they were inferior through forced assimilation. What we see now are a group of people who receive benefits when staying on reservations, but these benefits are scant and aren't overall helpful in escaping poverty. People who leave reservations lose those benefits, but there is no guarantee that they would be able to escape poverty in this case either. Additionally, indigenous people are not able to build wealth from the ownership of their land like other American citizens. We should also consider the emotional trauma passed on through centuries through racist policies and trauma resulting from them, such as family members dying from easily preventable conditions and abuse. These are problems that would impact any person negatively. Although some policymakers might have meant well in their thinking and reflect a different time and culture in general, it's important to remember the amendments that are there to ensure equality for all. Humanity will never be perfect, but we should always be striving for better, if not for any reason, but because it is what we would want if we were in their shoes, and it is the just thing to do.